It's great to see everybody this morning, and it's good to be back together. Let's start with our prayer, and then I have a few announcements. Beloved God,
you promise that all who seek will find. Bless this pilgrim group as we continue on our journey towards you. Bless the questions, bless the wonder, and bless those who would help us to a deeper understanding of your will for us. In the words of St. Benedict, give us the wisdom to discover you, the intelligence to understand you, the diligence to seek after you, the patience to wait for you, eyes to behold you, a heart to meditate upon you, and a life to proclaim you, through the power of the Spirit of Jesus our Lord. Amen.
Just love that prayer, and Chris Lynn wrote it for us back years ago when we were just forming as the Seekers class. What I'm fumbling with here is Lost and Found from Friday night. If anybody, we had a really fun time. We did. And there's more at home, but there's an insulated cup with the Palmetto logo on it, and then 2 spreaders. And I'll take them back home if nobody, or you can speak to me later if you prefer not. Today, after the 10:15 service, Garnet Rogers and Adair Waters, I suppose weather permitting, are going to give a tour of the cemetery, and it starts right after the service over in the bell tower area. So it's only a 30-minute tour, and they're both on the archives committee, so they have a profoundly deep understanding and knowledge of our property here. So if it's raining, I'm not sure what the plan is. This is one of the anniversary celebration events, and we have another one coming up on Wednesday night. Lee Cobb, our organist and choir master, is going to give a talk here after the dinner about the music and the organ and here at the Advent. So that's another event in celebration of the 175th anniversary of our church. And women, if you made an RSVP, don't forget to come to the luncheon tomorrow. It's the ECW luncheon at 12:15. And let's see, I'd like to thank Linda Greenberg for wonderful refreshments and pretty flowers, and thank you so much for providing that today. And in advance, I want to say thank you to Chris Lynn and to Jeff Cantrell. Steve and I are going to be traveling for the next couple of weeks, and so Chris is going to preside, and Jeff is going to be responsible for videography. And thanks to both of them, both of you, for doing that. Appreciate that. And today we are honored and delighted to have Dr. A.K. Anderson from Wofford College as our speaker today and next Sunday. And Chris is going to give him a proper introduction, but we are delighted to have you. Thank you and welcome.
I started to just say that A.K. was defined by George Martin as the brightest student he ever taught, and leave it at that. But some of you may not know George well and know what a high accolade that is. So, A.K. graduated from Wofford in 1990, got his master's at Yale Divinity School, did his doctoral work at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and has been teaching at Wofford for several years. His area is specifically Christian history and thought, especially focused on the effects of technological, scientific, and social advances of the last 200 years, and how they influence the nature of religious belief. So that's kind of right up our faith and ethics theme for the year. And he's also a most delightful educator. And he can make things relatable even to us, who are not the brightest students that George Martin ever encountered. Okay.
So it is so good to be here. I'm going to pull this out just because I'm from Northeast Tennessee and grew up in a Southern Baptist high school, so I feel more like roaming around, and I grew up watching televangelist back in the day, so this maybe feels a little more at home for me. I would say before we get into the program, I had never heard the prayer of St. Benedict that was on there, and I freely confess to you, I sort of teared up when I think it's beautiful. However, then when you pulled out the lost and found items, I was like, what kind of group have I gotten myself into? And not necessarily in a bad way. I was like, wow, I really stumbled onto something here. But before I get into what I'm going to do today, there were several people that I passed a sheet of paper out to before who did not receive one of those. And I'm just, if you'll keep your hand up, I'm coming. Oh, that's terrific. Thank you. Thanks so much. So, the way things are going to work today is I will talk for the first half. So I'll do the lifting, then we're going to shift with whatever time is left, and you will do the talking, and I will just sit back here with the items from the lost and found and see what I can do with them. So, Chris, in her introduction, told you about my academic background. I would say, since she brought it up, and I've been compelled to think about this recently, I've never done like a top 5 or top 10 list of the most influential people in my life, but George Martin is probably in the top 5, and I think of him fondly often. But in the past, when I have been at Advent, I have, so far as I can remember, talked about issues specifically related to Christianity because that is my academic background. However, my teaching has changed somewhat dramatically in the past few years, so I'm going to just quickly relate that to you as a way of getting into the topic today. So, 2016, I was advising the capstone thesis of one of my all-time favorite students, Pfeiffer Nicholson. Pfeiffer came to Wofford as a biology major, and in an almost unheard of scenario, dropped biology not because he couldn't handle it, but he switched to religion because he wanted to. But his plan always was to go to med school. So he majored in religion with the plan of going to med school, and he currently is at Duke in a joint Master of Divinity MD program. So he has 2 MD-ish degrees, or will eventually. So anyway, Pfeiffer and I would have these kind of wide-ranging conversations during our advising sessions, and as part of that, I was sitting there, and through things he said, and at Wofford, every student has to take one religion course. It's gen ed, just like everybody has to take one history with Dr. Roderick or someone else. And I was sitting there, it's like, religion and medicine would be just a perfect introductory class for so many of our students because we have a lot of pre-med people. But even if you're not pre-med, religion and medicine can be a very useful or interesting topic. So I put in the groundwork and got up and running. In fall of 2017, offered for the first time a course on religion and medicine. And I don't know where I thought it would go, but it has become my thing that I am most in love with. And I then subsequently taught it 15 terms in a row, because it could have been one where I taught it twice and I was like, boy, that stunk. There's no need to go back to that. So that's one explanation for why we're going to be talking about what we're discussing the next 2 weeks. And as part of me getting into that, Dr. Roderick, Dr. Christine Dinkins in philosophy, and some other professors and I eventually worked together on revising our medical humanities program, which is now medicine and the liberal arts, which Dr. Roderick and Dr. Dinkins are the co-coordinators of. So that's become another part of what I do as well. So anyway, that's why today I'm not talking specifically about anything particularly Christian. I am on my very first sabbatical. And goodness gracious, sabbaticals are wonderful. Wow, I had no idea. And through just twists and turns, which I'm not going to get into, what I have been working on is what is in your hands right now, this sheet of paper. So what I have for you is something I've been buried in a cave for like the last 3 months working on. And it's an introductory anthology on religion and medicine. And so the preliminary edition, if everything continues to go okay, and I've managed to stay on time with the book company, the preliminary kind of test edition will come out this fall, and then a full-fledged first edition will come out next year, which is exciting. So what I'm going to do today for the first bit is just talk you through the table of contents to give you kind of the broad picture of what's in this. But then, in the second part today and next week, we will zoom in on specific things from the book. And part of the reason I'm going over the whole table of contents is in case any of this sounds interesting to you, I would be more than happy to come back at a later date if that would be of any use to you. So, here we go. The book's title, which I'm only mentioning because I tried to come up with something that as much as possible summed up what is going on in the book, is Religion and Medicine from the Pre-Axial Age to Modernity, an introductory reader. And the title is significant, or it'll be significant in a couple of minutes. So the book works this way. I mean, it's got symmetry if nothing else. So that at least came out of 3 months in the cave. So the book has 3 units. Every unit has 3 chapters, and every chapter has 3 readings by other people. So again, it's an anthology, which is very useful for me in teaching, because if I had written the book, I would never teach it in class because that would seem weird to me. But that's a story for another time. Some people can do that and it works for them, but I don't even know what that would mean. So, in my experience, and this may not be the case with folks in this room, but again, just in my experience, when people, and this is often the case with my students, or at least in the beginning, when I started teaching in religion and medicine, I think for some people, when they hear that and they hear there's a class on it, the automatic assumption is, oh, this is going to be about, on day X, we'll hear about religious group Y and what they think about religious treatment Z. Which, I mean, that certainly can be part of religion and medicine, which is great. But I do remember, just as an example, early on when I was teaching in religion and medicine and had started this course, I had a student come up to me after class, and I don't remember what we had covered, and he was basically saying, well, that was fine, but when are we going to talk about what Jehovah's Witnesses think about blood transfusion? And I said, well, unfortunately, we're not going to be covering that this term. Not that there would not that, I mean, that could certainly be interesting. The point is, I have kind of, through teaching this many, many times, come up with kind of my own way of thinking about this. And I say that to get into the table of contents. So Unit 1, the title is something to the effect, I'm not looking at it right now, Religion, Health, and Healers. So this section is about some more general issues than I think the last two sections have. So chapter 1 has 3 topics that when you first hear them, you might think, it doesn't sound like religion's got anything to do with any of these. So I have one essay on the topic of health. What is health? Which is not an easy question to answer, in case you were wondering. One chapter on illness and the nature of illness, especially the impacts of illness on social relationships. And the author of that chapter, Javi Carrell, herself suffers from a breathing condition. And her chapter in this is very memorable by talking about the way people have related to her once they find out she has an illness. Some people are inviting and other people are sort of like, see ya, without saying that, but I mean, automatically they become uncomfortable. And then the third chapter the third reading is about the placebo effect, which I don't know how much you've thought about the placebo effect or studied it. It's a fascinating topic. But again, all 3 of those can be talked about totally apart from religion, but the way this book is set up is to indicate that there are real religious issues involved with each of them. And so that's why we begin that way. It's a very general chapter in a way, but it does show that this isn't just going to be about what does religious group X thinks about in vitro fertilization. That's not really the point of the book. Chapter 2 is religion and medicine, conjunctions and disjunctions. So where are areas of overlap between religion? Where are points where they do diverge? In our society, maybe. For some people, these seem like 2 totally alien universes, and you're either in a religious world or you're in a medical world. For some people, maybe they merge much more. The first reading is by Bisan Salhi, who is a physician at Emory and I think also a professor at Emory. And she's making the case that actually religion and medicine share a lot more than maybe we in contemporary society think they do. Whether she's always convincing in that, it doesn't really matter. It's more that's the case she's making. The second reading is about the extent to which religious studies or understanding human spirituality should be part of the academic training of doctors. And so this has been a movement, I think, in the last 40 years. The question being, can doctors deal really well with a wide range of patients without at least having some competence with dealing with spiritual issues? I mean, if you're sitting there at the bedside and the patient starts talking about God, what do you do? I mean, do you run? Do you start praying with them? I don't think so. So how is that handled? So this article is addressing the topic, is this something med schools should go to? If so, what program or type of program should they use? And then the third reading in that chapter, in all honesty, if it didn't fit, I would still stick it in because Arthur Kleinman is one of the handful of leading English language scholars in the field of medicine in the last 5 decades. So it's just exciting to have him in there, but his essay is the reporting about 6 different physicians and issues they have dealt with. So one of the people he talks about is a Chinese medical practitioner. Another person is a kind of typical Western doctor, but he's at the end of his career and he's lamenting how medicine has changed as a result of advances in medicine, and he feels that patients aren't being taken care of the way, in terms of personal relationships, maybe they once were. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 I can talk about more briefly. This is about what I'm calling religious pledges in the world of medicine, or just pledges. The one that in our society we are most familiar with is the Hippocratic Oath. So it's almost, I would be negligent if the Hippocratic Oath wasn't involved in this book. But it is not, by far, the only such pledge in human history. And in my experience, students often, they know the Hippocratic Oath, and then their assumption is that's kind of like the only oath doctors ever had in history, which is certainly not true. I wanted to have in this a famous Chinese doctor's oath, but because of licensing, we couldn't get that. I wanted to have a famous Indian medical oath. Licensing prevented that too. So instead, we have something that is more a prayer than an oath that's attributed to the Jewish scholar Moses Maimonides. So Hippocratic Oath, Moses Maimonides, who was Middle Ages. The last essay I included for other reasons, but given being in 2023, this may be the one people sit up and it's like, Ukraine? You've got something about Ukraine in here? And this is a really interesting essay. It's by an anthropologist at Wofford College in Iowa. And what she's covering is the role of the Hippocratic Oath in Ukraine post the fall of the Soviet Union, which gets into the issues of how not well physicians in Ukraine are paid and why that is. So that's Unit 1. Again, religion, health, and healers. And so far we haven't had anything about what a particular group thinks about anything. All of these, though, are relevant topics to religion and medicine. Unit 2, we get into more history, and this is where the title of the book is explained, more so. So again, the title of the book is Religion and Medicine from the Pre-Axial Age to Modernity. So there are three chapters that I mentioned. It goes by threes. 3 chapters in Unit 2. The first one deals with what I'm calling pre-axial medicines.
I have to know, I'm sorry. So, axial, is that the wheel? What's the deal?
That's I will.
You can tell us.
I will break it down for you, and I'm glad you asked. Because chapter 5, which is in a way the central chapter in the book, both literally and figuratively, is something I'm calling the axial medicines. And then chapter 6 deals more with what many people in our society would call modern medicine. But in this book, the term I'm using is biomedicine. So we'll start with chapter 5 and get to the question about what this means, and then work our way back and forward, and then we'll be close to the end of the book, and then we'll get to more of the discussion for today. So, let's see, I should have done the math before this. Roughly 75 years ago, I think that's right, a German scholar, Karl Jaspers, was the first person to explicitly develop the idea of the axial age. And there's a whole slew of scholarship on this, but the nutshell version of what the axial age goes like this. His theory was and is that during a certain period of time, it's a slice of about 600 years, give or take, there were kind of breakthroughs in religious and philosophical thought in multiple different locations. It was not a global thing. So that's part of the axial age theory. It didn't happen everywhere. And the civilizations that are most identified with this are India, Greece, China, and Israel. So these are, in the academic literature, the main civilizations referred to as axial civilizations. So what happened, the period is 800 to 200 BCE. So what is it that makes that axial, which again, it's like what history turns on. It's kind of this dividing line. It's the axis that history turns on. Jasper's claim is, which many scholars have developed, other scholars have dismissed, that's how academics goes, is that in China, India, Greece, and Israel, again, especially with regard to religion and philosophy, there was this breakthrough of thinking in new ways about a transcendent or higher realm that had not existed before. So why 800 to 200 BCE? This is the era when Buddha lives and dies, Confucius lives and dies, Taoism is born, Hinduism has many developments within it, as well as with Judaism. And so, axial age theory traditionally has focused on religion and philosophy. What this book is doing is saying, well, wait a minute, if there were breakthroughs in religion and philosophy in those civilizations, there were also breakthroughs in medicine as well. So chapter 5, which again is called the Axial Medicines, has one reading on Hippocratic or Greek medicine, which is Hippocrates lives during this time. There's a reading on what we now call traditional Chinese medicine, which also gets up and running during this 600-year period. And then there is Ayurveda, which is the traditional Indian form of healing, which has deep connections with Hinduism as well. And so, just to say a couple of quick words about these, I'm guessing nobody has been driving through Spartanburg or Greenville or even Packlet. I don't know if you drive through Packlet or not, but anyway, story for another time. And seen a Hippocratic medicine office. That would be strange. But very near our house in Converse Heights, there is a Chinese acupuncture and medical little building. And I got an Ayurveda cookbook at Costco, which shows how mainstream Ayurveda has become in certain ways. So 2 of these 3 axial medicines continue on in influence. Hippocratic medicine is more in the rearview mirror, but they all emerge roughly around the same time and develop a new way of thinking about medicine than had existed before. What had existed before, this is what this book in chapter 4 is calling the preaxial medicines. And preaxial is basically code for indigenous or folk medicines, which still exist today too. So it's not like axial medicines came and the preaxial disappeared. It was more that now there are 2 forms of medicine, 2 broad forms of medicine in the world rather than just the preaxial. So chapter 4 has 3 readings, and I will confess to you, which I would not do to the editor I'm working with, the first reading in chapter 4 may not be actually the best one I could have picked for this chapter, but it's Claude Lévi-Strauss, so I had to pick it. Because I mean, if you can do an anthology and have Claude Lévi-Strauss in it, that's pretty cool. So, but I mean, it is relevant to the topic too. So what his essay, which I think may be like the most difficult, I mean, the writing itself is clear, but it's kind of a tough nut to crack. But what he's dealing with is sorcery or shamanism in South and North America. So he goes from Brazil, works his way up to New Mexico, and then talks about Canada at the end. So that's one stream of indigenous or folk medicine, which is in our part of the world. The second reading deals more with traditional African medicine, which is a totally different way of approaching indigenous medicine, or a different form of indigenous medicine, but there may be overlap as well. The third reading is by a guy named Wade Davis, and you may not have heard of him, and you may not have heard of what I'm getting ready to mention, but I remember as a kid, back before there was an internet, and it may have even been before we had cars, I can't remember, but anyway, a long time ago, it was revolutionary, the VHS. which now you find in thrift shops, and that's about it. But we would go to the local video store, and there was a movie called The Serpent and the Rainbow, and the cover itself scared me, and I was too scared to watch it. But that's based on a book by this guy. I still haven't watched the movie, because it might scare me. But what his article does is whereas Levi-Strauss is about North and South America, and the second essay is about Africa in particular, his essay in 13 pages goes all over the globe, which has pluses and minuses, but one minute he's talking about the Amazon, the next minute he's talking about Korea. So he brings other geographical locations into that chapter. So chapter 4 is indigenous medicine, chapter 5 is what I'm calling the axial medicines, and then chapter 6 deals with, according to this anthology, because I only got like 300 pages to have a reasonable price on it for the book, biomedicine or modern medicine. So, if you have 3 readings on biomedicine, what might you choose? What I have done is thought about, in some ways, the question of, well, when did biomedicine begin? And the second reading gets to more the heart of the answer, but there is a way of answering this to say the ball at least got started in the 16th century with new forms of scientific thinking. And so someone in the past year I've become somewhat obsessed with is the 16th century anatomist Vesalius, who's just really interesting. So the first reading deals with him as a path breaker in the human understanding of the human body. The second reading jumps ahead to what I actually think of as the actual beginning of biomedicine, the 19th century, and there's a single chapter on microbiology as one instance of this much broader series of advances in medical understanding. The last reading, in a way, is a bridge to the last section, which then we'll get to, and then we can at least have some discussion. This is, I feel, this was an article I wasn't aware of before I started doing this process. And when I read it, I was like, it must go in the anthology. Even if Claude Levi-Strauss must go, Eric Krakauer must be in there. So what Krakauer is dealing with, and this is the only title I will actually read to you, To Be Freed from the Infirmity of the Age, Subjectivity, Life-Sustaining Treatment, and Palliative Medicine. What he's dealing with, he's going beyond the 19th century into the 20th century as biomedicine gets better and better about being able to extend human life, but the ethical questions that come up because of that. So I think it's a glorious article, and again, it's only like 13 or 14 pages, but so well done, and it leads into the final section, which I will touch on just briefly. The Unit 3 is titled The Wonders and Challenges of Biomedicine. So the title acknowledges that medical understanding has grown enormously in the past 200 years, in the past 5 years. I mean, it grows exponentially. But I think it's fair to say, simultaneous to all that growth and understanding and achievement, the ethical issues have grown exponentially as well. And to the point that it's almost hard for ethical thought to keep up with the advances of medicine. Because medicine's going to advance whether we want it to or not. And so the ethical thought has to be running as fast as it can to try to address some of the questions that come up. What we'll cover briefly today deals with chapter 7. But let me jump ahead, because next week, when I will talk much less, chapters 8 and 9 get more specific. Chapter 7 is more general. So chapter 8 is 3 different articles about organ transplants, which have only been around, the first major organ transplant was done basically at the time of Carl Jasper's developing the theory about the axial age. So 70 years, is that right? Yes, so we're talking roughly about 70 years. So chapter 8 deals with different aspects of that. For example, the second reading, is it ever right to buy or sell human organs? Discuss while I flee the room. And I will just throw this in, because this again was someone I actually wasn't familiar with. Didn't know this article. The third reading, Martine Rothblatt is actually the founder of SiriusXM. And I look forward to teaching this article because it's the one that is most in the direction of sci-fi. So I lied, this will be the other title I read to you. Borders are not always boundaries. Are genetically engineered xenolungs from pigs feasible before the end of this decade? Again, discuss. Good luck. Wish you the best. So chapter 8 is specifically about organ transplants. Chapter 9, which is what I will pick one of these topics for next week and we'll get into one of those. I haven't quite decided yet. There are two specific issues and then one that's kind of related, but it's more general. So the first reading is about the incredible extension of life that has emerged because of biomedicine and all the questions that come about because of that. And probably that's what we're going to talk about next week. I think we will. But the other thing we could talk about is the second reading, which is gene editing. And it's not that those two things aren't related, but they can be separated. The final essay I'm excited about because it is a scholar from the University of Oklahoma talking about American Indian perspective on the more general phenomenon of transhumanism, which life extension is related to that, but it goes beyond that as well. So 8 and 9 are more specific, but here we go. Chapter 7. This is, again, a more general chapter, kind of akin to the very first chapter of the book. So health, illness, and placebo effect can be talked about apart from religion completely, but they have great, deep religious implications. You just have to trust me on that for the moment. Chapter 7, if we just look at the first two titles, the first one will be my own contribution, and this is what we're going to talk about just in a minute. Playing God. So just hold on to that. The second essay, which I love, and I love the scholars involved with it, is called Doing What Comes Naturally. So these two are more general, and they fit under the title of this chapter, Relating Higher Reality, or Religion, to, how do I put it, the natural world. Okay, so I apologize for taking so long in talking you through this, but I did want you to have the whole context to understand why we'll be talking about playing God in the first place and not just think maybe I have a God complex and I'm trying to work it out publicly or something. So this is how we end up talking about this. So what I initially had was, because no expense was spared for today, tiny handouts for you as well. But if I go through the process of handing those out, we're going to lose the rest of our time and it wouldn't really work this way. So here's what we're going to do. I had on these sheets 8 different topics. And the point of the exercise is to try to at least begin to understand what playing God means, or at least the issues involved with the concept of playing God. So, what I picked here, none of these have anything to do with medicine. And that was deliberate because just like health, illness, and placebo effect can be talked about apart from religion, playing God can be talked about apart from medicine. So it's kind of the reverse. Playing God is not some kind of technical academic term. You can hear it in discussions on cable TV or on podcasts, in everyday discussion. So we say it, many people say it, but what does it mean? And do we know what it means? That's part of the point of this. So instead of giving you these, and if anybody wants one of these as a souvenir, please come up afterwards. And also don't forget this as well, or else it's going home with me. What I have are just some little scenarios. So what I will do is maybe we can get to 2 or 3 of these. I'll just read it out to you and we'll get maybe 2 responses. To what extent, if any, do you think the thing that I read to you is playing God, according to your understanding? And we have 6, 9, 12, 15, about 30 people in here. We might have 10 different understandings of what playing God means, which would be great. Doesn't have to be just one. So, given the time, I'm not going to start at the top of the list. Let's go with this one because I forced my 18-year-old son to listen to a philosophy podcast on this recently. I'm not sure he'll speak to me again, but scientists proceed to achieve the de-extinction of a species. Is that playing God? So what is de-extinction? And you may be totally familiar with this, so I'm not insulting you. This has been floating around for many years now. The idea to attempt, for whatever reason, and there could be various reasons for doing this, to bring back to life a species that has gone extinct. And if you want the technical explanation for that, that comes at 10:30 in the parking lot. So I'm not doing that now because I don't know if I can. But anyway, so let's say scientists do succeed in doing that. Do you think that would be playing God? Is it not playing God? Is it sort of? Any thoughts? Yes?
You gotta wonder why. What's the reason? Why does somebody want to reconstitute a woolly mammoth, for instance, or a dinosaur?
Would their reasoning impact the way you think about whether it's playing God or not? Or you're just more saying, like, why? We've got enough problems. Why do we want to add another species?
Jurassic Park, for instance. I mean, I never even saw the movie, but I could probably relate to half of it. I don't see what good came from that.
Okay, so that's one way to think of, if we're thinking about playing God, one question could be, which does relate to some of the other topics as well, what is being achieved by this thing? Is it good or bad? And in this case, one question may just be, well, why would we do that anyway? So that's one take on this. Anybody else? Yes?
I kind of think there's a difference here. I mean, a woolly mammoth, that was a natural consequence of what was going on. Okay, so let's don't do that, because that was, a consequence of good and evil. But if we could bring back animals that humans are responsible for killing because of our polluting things, then that's just a good thing, and we ought to do it.
Yeah, and having spent, again, an hour, not to give you more detail about my life than you need to know, but getting lost twice between Boiling Springs and Chesney while listening to this philosophy podcast, which is maybe why I got lost. Scholars who bring this up, this is in particular what they tend to focus on. It's like, do we have an obligation? If we could bring back animals that we were responsible for them disappearing,
Right.
do we have an obligation? So just real quickly, and then we'll come over here. To you, would that be playing God even if it's a good thing? Or because it is a good thing, therefore it isn't playing God?
Yeah, it's playing God.
Oh, it is. And why? What makes it bad?
I don't know.
Creating fun, yeah.
Yeah, and,
Yeah.
and let me just be clear, part of the reason for going through this exercise, it's not like under all this I have the correct answer for what playing God is. It's more to eliminate the fact that if we're sitting, or if we're in a society and people start throwing well, that's playing God, there may be 5 different meanings of that, and that may prevent us from having a productive discussion if we're kind of talking past each other. And I think playing God it's a tough nut to crack exactly what it means. Is there one meaning? I'm not sure there is. So somebody might say, let's do it, and it is playing God, go for it. And how about you?
Well, I was, along that same line, suppose we, humans eliminated the mosquito by mistake. Should we then reconstitute mosquitoes? Which are responsible for millions of people dying. You know, if you're gonna do it for some pretty toad, or, you know, some other animal, why not the mosquito? And I guess that again gets to, is that playing God or? Because now it's a choice between what type of animals do we bring back?
And, I mean, if we could bring the prayer back up on the screen, we might add the prayer for the disappearance of the mosquitoes, or at least I would, and they actually don't bother me that much, but very annoying. So that's a good question. I mean, how do we decide? If once we've achieved the capability of doing it,
And who decides?
and who decides? So let's come here and back there, and then we'll see where we're at time-wise.
What about those who subscribe to the theory of evolution, that those things that die off are meant to die off because they're not, they can't keep up, so to speak. So why would you want to reintroduce them just to have them suffer all over again and then die off again?
Yeah, which then, the whole term playing God, and I think this fits with what you're saying, and there are other ways this can be applied. In my experience, because I've been leading discussions on this with students at Wofford for a number of years now, because as I developed a class on religion mess, I was like, oh, we're going to talk about playing God every semester, if only so I can do field research on what people think about this. It has become pretty quickly apparent to me, and I'm not alone in this, that the whole idea of playing God is closely linked to what we think of as nature, almost so that it's hard to see if we're actually talking about God or nature. And so one response would be, it is natural that not all species make it, so we would be going against nature, trying to go in and bring them back. So let's come here, and then we'll be about out of time for today. Yes?
There's a corollary to the discussion we're having here, and that is, if through learning how to bring back the woolly mammoth, we discover something that might offer an opportunity to improve an existing species. And now you're talking about, does God do that sort of thing, or does he forget all about it? Or, I mean, it offers different opportunities rather than just physically bringing the woolly mammoth to existence. It might help improve the human race, who knows? I mean, that's a question.
And I would add to that, which follows on what we were just talking about, oftentimes, again, just in my observation, hearing very bright young people talk about this topic, it boils down to us and nature. Like, nature's over there and we're over here, and how do we relate? Without addressing the question, we're part of nature too, and is part of our nature, I'm not advocating this, just saying, I thought of this being lost late at night between Boiling Springs and Chesney, so I can't be held accountable for it necessarily. is it part of our nature to learn how to do these things so that we can improve the world, which then it gets much more murky about, well, what is playing God and not. Last comment, I think, for the day, because we need to end at 10, right? Yeah.
Well, scientists have inquisitive minds, and I'm not sure God enters into it in some respects. I think they look and they see what they can do, not necessarily the outcome of what happens after they can do it, but if they can create something, it's a challenge. And I don't think that in some respects God enters into it at all.
Which then, I think gets back to what was said over here about who makes these decisions. And one part of that whole equation is medicine and science are advancing afoot. And how many instances are there where someone can step in and say, wait a minute, you can't do that. And I don't think we're going to talk about gene editing next week, right? But you may be well familiar with this, but I think it goes to what you're saying. CRISPR and gene editing, initiated by Jennifer Doudna and a couple of other colleagues. I have a video I show students in 2015 of Jennifer Doudna standing up, doing a TED Talk, very principled. It's about, we need to have a moratorium on the use of gene editing, germline gene editing, until we figured out the moral issues. 3 years later, He Jiankui in China was gene editing a pair of twins. It didn't matter to him what Jennifer Doudna had said at a nice TED Talk with everybody like, yes, that's right. Because the regulations that exist globally, maybe not so great. So thank you all for today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
I don't think we're gonna.